Today, we're going to be checking out the Yamaha CS-80. As we all know, it's quite the legendary synthesizer. We'll talk about its sonic potential and its pitfalls. Stick around and check it out. Hi, I'm Roland Bettis for Alamo Music Center, San Antonio, Texas. Be sure to check us out online at alamomusic.com and be sure to like and subscribe on our YouTube channel, Alamo Music Sound Lab. We have lots of videos coming up in the future for some awesome synthesizers and cool gadgetry, so be sure to check it out. Stick around. The CS-80, such a classic, legendary synthesizer. Lots of bands have used it before, bands like Toto, artists like Brian Eno, but you probably know this synthesizer from one person alone, Vangelis. This was Vangelis' voice, if you will. All the soundtracks that he did, for example, Chariots of Fire, and of course, Blade Runner, were done with primarily this synthesizer. This was his main synth. Although he had many others, this was his main voice. Using this kind of synthesizer, I think, adds so much more expression than any other synthesizer I've ever played. And by him utilizing all these controls and all the flexibility that it offers, kind of paved its way for a new form of soundtrack and song creation. Artists like Hans Zimmer or Cliff Martinez, who've done many, many soundtracks, I don't think those artists would have been quite the same without Vangelis, and in particularly Vangelis using the CS-80. So just by knowing the history of this keyboard, you might be wondering, is it really worth all the money that people spend on it? Upwards of $40,000, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 for this particular keyboard. That's a pretty tall order, right? Is it worth it? Is it worth the money? Is it worth the hassle to maintain? Because a lot of these parts you just can't get anymore. So if something were to go awry, you kind of have to build your own part for it. I don't know. I think it does have some magic and some chemistry with it that you really just can't get on any other keyboards. Although Yamaha has decided to recreate some of these sounds and techniques on some of the modern synthesizers, for example, the Reface CS, which does have kind of like that CS tone, it really isn't as bold and just energetic as the CS-80 itself. So I do think it's worth it. Let's take a listen and find out. Okay, let's talk about the layout. The CS-80 is comprised of essentially two engines. And we have the mix between those two engines right over here by this paddle switch. We have mix 1 and mix 2. If we went to mix 1, all of the top controls would modify that engine itself. Go to mix 2, this bottom section is that secondary synth engine. Right in between you get the blend of them both, which is really kind of neat. Each engine has a lot of stuff to augment and sculpt from. You do have a really amazing filter section, high pass and low pass, resonance on both. To me, the high pass filter is really an amazing thing on the CS-80. Just about the only other high pass filter I really enjoyed using on a synthesizer was Roland's SH5 high pass filter. But this one just really takes a cake. It's really special and it has its own sound. It's a little bit of a buzzy thing. And of course, it also has the oscillator section. You have the noise generator right over here, and of course you have how you engage, for example, sawtooth, etc., etc. You do have pulse width modulation for the pulse wave right over here. And again, that's on both engines, right? So that's a pretty neat thing by itself. Over here we have the envelope section. So your pretty typical stuff. You have your attack, decay, sustain, and release. But if you can see, they're all kind of labeled a little bit differently. The overall layout that you're looking at right now is not typical of your typical synthesizer. I mean, most people think of, say, for example, a Korg MS-20 or a Mini Moog, and all those keyboards are knob-laden. There's knobs for every one of the things you would modify. On the CS stuff, it's all done with these sliders. And the sliders are kind of like a different, well, they're counter directions. It's a negative direction. So for example, by pushing it up, it's not more, it's less. So it's kind of an interesting way to create on the synthesizer. You have to kind of retool and rethink the way it operates before you kind of just dive in there. Because it really doesn't respond like your typical synthesizer. the far right section right over here is something really, really special. So I can essentially assign any one of these parameters to the touch response of the key bed, right? So I could do brilliance, which is kind of like a filter thing, the level of that engine, and again, that's for the initial touch of it. Over here I have the aftertouch section. So you can have the brilliance of your velocity and the brilliance of your aftertouch as you dig into the keyboard set totally differently. One could be maxed out, one could be minimized, or vice versa. Same thing with the level of that oscillator, the loudness of that oscillator. That's all controlled right over here. And again, you have that times 2. So every engine has its own assignments for the key bed, which is really pretty phenomenal. I think just looking at that alone, you start to get a glimpse of what Vangelis did and how he utilized this keyboard to really create some amazing soundtracks. It's not your typical keyboard. A lot of keyboardists, when they're playing a synthesizer, would say be doing a pad or a lead or a bass or a lead line, and they'd be modifying that tone real time with their hands with some knobs, for example, the LFO or the slider. Well, on this keyboard, you can do all that without having to touch this. You could do it by playing the key bed. And I really say playing the key bed because that's what it takes. The most gentlest touch can yield one tone. And of course, the heaviest touch can yield something completely different. And I'll just demonstrate some of that for you later on when I get to just playing a couple patches on this keyboard. But yeah, an amazing synthesizer with a different way of playing, that's for sure. Right below our engines right here, we have some real-time modifiers. Of course, we already talked about the Mix 1 to the Mix 2. We have, again, Brilliance and Resonant, which is a filter, for the overall. So check this out. You have this filter, this filter, that filter, but then you have another filter for the overall. I mean, come on. Isn't that special? It's pretty dang amazing, that's for sure. Once again, with touch response, we've already talked about assigning volume and filter to the initial touch and the after touch. But what about things like pitch bend, an LFO with speed, and you can put that LFO on the oscillator or the filter or both or all. And then you have more control over the keyboard right here. You have another low brilliance and high brilliance and another low level and high level. So really, this section right here is meant to go further than what this section is. It's very rare that any keyboard out there would have just one or two of these controls, but having it magnified times this, times this, times this, times this, well, it's pretty amazing. Anyhow, let's move on. Over here we have the feet section, which is really just like the octave section. So we have 16, 8, 5 1/3, 4th, 2 1/3, and the 2. And all these are click switches, so you really know where you're getting into. There's no variable in between it. It's just one or the other, which is great. We have our preset selection right over here. Presets are good. They're not phenomenal, but you do have your panel right over here. When you click on panel section, that's when you really get to utilize all of this lovely stuff. When you have the preset section, you really have what's been programmed and stored under these buttons, so to speak. You do have some modification control with this section here, but you really don't have the control of this on those presets. This kind of harkens back to the way home organs used to be back in the 70s. And Yamaha made a lot of professional and home organs that looked very much like this panel. Had the sliders and the paddle switches, had the different color codes, et cetera, had the multicolored buttons that demonstrated the presets. In fact, Yamaha made a few professional organs that had some of the circuitry from the CS series in them. So if you're lucky enough to have one of those home organs, there is a little bit of that CS stuff in there as well, at a fraction of the price tag. So I think they were called Yamaha Electones. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's what they are. And only the upper echelon of those Electones had that CS thing going on with it. Anyhow, moving on. To the left of the left of the left, we have sub-oscillator and ring modulator settings. I think once you hear this ring modulator in action, which I'll demonstrate later on, you'll identify it quickly as the Vangelis sound effect. He used this section a lot on just about every song that he did throughout the late 70s and early 80s, including that Blade Runner soundtrack. So very much a very cool effect. Speaking of effects, right down below you've got another effects section, which is a chorus, a tremolo, and you have the on and off switch for that. You do have a speed and depth for the tremolo and the chorus section, which is kind of cool. To me, you know, I think this is probably the weakest part of the synthesizer. When I think about chorus, I think about a Roland Juno 60 chorus, right? Very rich, lush, three-dimensional chorus. This is not quite like that. It's more of like a subtle chorus effect, and so is the tremolo, by the way. Over here we've got our glissando section, which is also a Vangelis staple, and you can control the amount of glissando and portamento via short to long with this slider. Same thing with this on sustain. Very cool keyboard, a lot of features. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention. Over here on the preset section, you do have memory 1, 2, 3, and 4. Well, how do you store sounds in this thing, right? Well, voila. Here you have memory 1, memory 2, memory 3, memory 4. And if you look at these and look at all the letters right above these particular sliders, you'll see that they quickly are identified by what this section is. These are just miniature versions of these engines, right? Or they control these engines rather. So if I were to say tweak one of these things here, that's essentially like tweaking something right over here. Once you have it set, you could store it on this particular section. So you have one voice you could store, another, and another. That's pretty much it. You know, we're pretty spoiled nowadays. Every synthesizer, even the analog stuff, can store presets and a multitude of them. Back in the day, this is kind of what you had. And even then, when this came out, that was like mind-blowingly cool. It was so advanced, right? From what I understand, I read in a couple of interviews, Vangelis, when he used this keyboard, he really didn't rely on the factory presets much. He really relied on the presets that he created, or just going straight to the panel and just tweaking out that synth engine right then and there. A true synthesist at heart. Rest in peace, Vangelis. Okay, amazing keyboard, we already know that, right? But what about the deficiencies? What are the cons of owning one of these synthesizers? Well, number one, the weight. I mean, it's over 200 pounds with the lid on it. If you take the lid off, it's just slightly under 200 pounds. So if you wanted to move it from one side of the studio to the other, you really need some help with that. And, you know, forbid you have to gig with it. I mean, number one, carrying it around is just as bad as carrying a Fender Rhodes. And number two, the instability of the tuning. These things are so delicate. Every engine has its trim pots that control the tuning of the synthesizer. If there's 8 voices here and 8 voices here, there's about 5 or 6 trim pots below each one of those that actually tune the keyboard all across the key bed, all across the octaves. So you really have to spend a lot of time getting it to behave properly and stay in tune. And I will say this, when we first got this keyboard, it was massively out of tune. And it took me several turns over the course of a few days just to get it back in tune. And then we moved it 5 feet to put it from one table to another table, and it went out of tune again. The trim pots on these keyboards are so very delicate, and they're not really reinforced properly. That's one of the Achilles heel of the CS series. And it's really kind of mind-blowing because when you open up the top panel, you could see that a lot of craftsmanship went into making this keyboard. There's a lot of cable looms that are hand-tied, and hand-tied every few inches. So you would think that if they put a lot of care into the way it was built, they probably would have put better trim pots on it. At least that would have been my request. Even if it meant bumping up the price a few extra whatevers, I think it would have been well worth it. So yeah, the tuning is just not quite right if you move it just a few feet. It might be this particular example, but it's something I've heard about from other people owning the CS-80. So just know, if you have the budget and the want to have one of these, then get your toolkit ready to start tuning, buddy. It's coming. The last deficiency I'll say about this keyboard is that a lot of these parts you just simply can't get anymore. They're not fabricated anymore, so trying to track down replacement parts is extremely difficult. In the rare instance that you have to, for example, replace something or something is faulty, it really means you'd have to rebuild it, design something new in its place and implement it. And that circuitry might be a little different. So, for example, this slider might not be exactly the same height or the same feel as the other ones, simply because you're making do with what you have or what you can have. All in all, I'll say that with its deficiencies, I think the sound is just amazingly unique and so expressive and so musical. And I mean, gosh, we've heard this keyboard throughout the decades, and it's added so much to my life. I couldn't fathom owning one of these simply because of the price tag. But if I had one, I would be sure to keep my chops up in maintaining it, because it is quite a substantial, awesome synthesizer, the CS-80. I really hope you enjoy the Yamaha CS-80 and a closer look into it. It was such a joy to play and to describe and to show you all what its potential is, and of course showing you some of the pitfalls that it has. All in all, such a legendary classic synthesizer of just an amazing pedigree. And by the way, this month marks Yamaha's 50th anniversary for synthesizer making. So hats off to Yamaha Corporation. Again, thanks very much for joining us today. This is Roland Bettis for Alamo Music San Antonio. Check us out online, alamomusic.com, and be sure to like and subscribe on our YouTube channel, Alamo Music Sound Lab. Thanks very much.